Hello and welcome back to another episode of Majlis and Markets. I am your host Hassan Jivraj. Join us for insightful conversations with leaders in Islamic and global markets. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe. You can also reach us at hassan@majlisandmarkets.com and follow us on LinkedIn at Majlis and Markets. Today, we're looking at Islamic finance in Canada. With Muslims now making up nearly 5% of Canada's population, demand for Islamic financial services is growing. Yet, the sector remains small and underdeveloped. To unpack the challenges and opportunities, we spoke with Mohammed Sawaf, founder and CEO of Manzil, Canada's leading Islamic fintech firm. With a doctorate in Islamic finance and a mission to reshape the industry, Mohammed shares his vision for the future. Please note, this episode was recorded last month, before Manzil recently acquired the US-based Islamic fintech firm Agaz. Mohammed Sawaf, welcome to Majlis and Markets. Great to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Hassan.
Mohammed, you've got like a really interesting background. I came across you back in 2020 when I was writing for an Islamic economy publication and writing about Islamic finance in Canada. And I thought your story was really fascinating, like not just with Manzil, but your background as well. But before we get into all of that, Mohammed, could you give our listeners your background story?
Yeah, absolutely. I take it back to post undergrad, which was 2007, just pre-financial crisis. And I did an undergrad in life sciences and then ended up in finance. Typical Middle Eastern brown story where your parents wanted you to become a doctor and you ended up not being. But alhamdulillah, I've always been in the role of financial advisory, financial planning, very focused in the retail advisory space, retail banking space. And that's really where Islamic finance was introduced to me above and beyond, this term riba. A lot of the community members were asking for products that we didn't have. And I thought it was just our firm, but in essence, it actually was across the country. I didn't mean much to me at the time. It was still early, and I just kind of pursued, the typical mandate of just building my book of business for those that really wanted my advice and my services. Fast forward to 2014, just felt like I was hitting that corporate ceiling. Things were getting dull. And I said to myself, let me pursue, an MBA, which I did at the University of Toronto's Rotman School of Management. And I actually got introduced to a professor there that was teaching the only Islamic finance course in the country at the time. And I expressed, my background, my history, my involvement within the community around this. And my focus was, does this class actually teach you that products can be accommodated within the Canadian regulatory, tax, and legal environment? And he said, absolutely. So I said, okay, well, can I take the class? And he said, no, you can't. It's for a different stream. But he said, I'll do you one better. Why don't you become my teaching assistant? I said, okay, alhamdulillah, that'd be great. And that was really, I would say, the impetus to my journey into Islamic finance and pursuing Menzil, because upon finishing my MBA, he then, wanted me to pursue my doctorate in Islamic finance. He became my supervisor for my thesis, alhamdulillah. That was 10 years of part-time study and 3 degrees later. In 2017, I decided to leave corporate and focus on, this specific space. Of course, doing all the research and knowing that there's a very strong Islamic finance market in the UK, and I've lend the UK lens on this, especially within the North American context, because we're common law jurisdiction. And I always said, well, if they can do it, we can do it, right? There shouldn't be any issues around that. And so we entered into an R&D phase for about 3 years, 2017 to 2020. And really working with kind of the best of the best within the fields of Islamic finance and Canadian finance and secular law, and really looking at how do we kind of bring these two worlds together. So when we launched in 2020, we launched originally with a murabaha based residential financing product backed by what we like to call the Menzel Mortgage Fund, and that's kind of how we attract capital for our program. And fast forward today, we're a multi-product shelf, alhamdulillah. managing over $100 million across, all products. And this is just the beginning. So hoping that kind of gives some insights into our listeners in terms of kind of the origin story here.
Amazing. Muhammad, before we get into all the details about Manzil and what you've been up to, I, I think you're a Palestinian origin, is that correct? You're from Palestine?
Yes, I'm ethnically Palestinian. I was born in Canada.
Okay, great. So I was kind of wondering, like, to myself before we started this conversation, like, what was it like growing up in a post 9/11 world in Canada as a Palestinian person or Palestinian origin person?
Yeah, so I would say the Palestinian part didn't specifically play a role. It would have been more Muslim Arab identity, especially post 9/11. Those were my high school days. Definitely, well, felt the discrimination, felt the racism. I was the leader of the MSA, during high school, and there was a lot of incidences that I had to, involve myself in with sisters and brothers that were being, verbally or physically attacked. And alhamdulillah, fast forward to today, I thought, we've moved on, but of course, in light of the recent, genocide that's happening, we're kind of back to that again, right? It's in the front fold. And the stigma is still there, the racism is still there. I feel now it's affecting me more as a Palestinian than kind of the 9/11 days, right? So it certainly played a role. We've always had, or at least I've always had this attitude of, you know, even when we're, at the same level, I'm still starting from behind. And hence, I need to kind of put in more than 100% effort. It's always this prove them wrong kind of mentality. And that's really what keeps me going. And of course, the support of family, support of the community, whether it be local or the broader community of Islamic finance has really propelled me to want to do more and to want to make an impact that's sustainable.
Fantastic. Speaking of community, Muhammad, we've covered a few topics before on the podcast. We've looked at the Australian Muslim communities and we've looked at the UK Muslim communities, but I don't think a lot of people in my listener space really know much about Canada. How would you characterize the Muslim community in Canada?
Yeah, I actually like to say that the Muslim community today in Canada is like the Muslim community of the UK 20 years ago. In terms of numbers, in terms of let's call it their mindset and kind of the way they approach things. So some quick stats. Today there's over 2 million Canadian Muslims that are represented amongst a population of 40 million. So it's about 5%. It is the second largest religious base in Canada, alhamdulillah, and it's also the fastest growing demographic. And it's going to continue to grow. So by 2030, so only 6 years from now, the Muslim population is expected to grow from 2 million to 3 million, inshallah. And of course, that's a 50% growth rate. And so with that comes, of course, the need and the demand for services above and beyond, of course, halal meat and the halal food industry, which we've seen literally become mainstream now in Canada. You can go to a Costco or any grocery store, and not only is it available, but it's actually priced similarly, right? So economies of scale have been introduced, and that's exactly where we want Islamic finance to be. And hopefully it doesn't take 40 years like the halal food industry took here in Canada.
And the Muslim community in Canada, where are they from? Are they from like Palestine or are they from Pakistan or are they from Lebanon? Where are they from?
Yeah, so the majority, I would say, are South Asia or Southeast Asia. So, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, is a very strong, contingent of this population. Arabs, of course, or Middle Easterns make up probably the second largest part of the population. But don't forget, there's Arab Muslims and there's Arab Christians, coming from all different backgrounds and ethnicities within that region. And then, of course, you have the North Africans, right, which is a very large population as well, especially the ones that come from French-speaking nations. So we'll find them in Quebec, for example, right, which is a French-speaking province in Canada. And so you'll find the Algerians and the Tunisians and the Moroccans and the Lebanese and even some of the Egyptians that tend to reside there, just because it's a lot. The language barrier isn't there versus coming to an Anglophone style province like Ontario. So, hopefully that gives some additional color and context to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just also wondering, like, if you look at the American Muslim community, they're quite well integrated and they're quite a fascinating community to look at. But if you compare it to say like UK or France or Australia, what would you say like the socioeconomic status is? Are they at the higher end or the lower end, or is it mixed?
So I would say the majority are kind of middle and upper class. You know, Muslims in Canada, I think the majority of them have arrived over the last 1 to 2 generations. Now, if you go to Edmonton, you can find fourth generation Lebanese, right? And, well integrated into society. And of course, not only at the socioeconomic level, but at other levels that play a factor into that. Even what we find with Menzel, like especially with the clients that are coming onto our database, especially in the mortgage product, we're seeing a very high quality of professionals and individuals taking that product. In the investment space, we find it's very, very similar or just above average to, let's say other robo investment advisory firms out there in Canada. So that kind of gives you a sense of where the Muslim is when it comes to investing versus financing. I think that overall, the Muslim community is still behind when it comes to the knowledge of investments. We're a saver style community, like we like to save, but we haven't had the knowledge base to invest because those investments weren't available to us. So there wasn't a need to understand kind of what investing products are or how does that affect, our income tax at the end of the year. And so I think, part and parcel of Menzel strategy has always been education and awareness, allowing them to understand, what does this mean for you? And you don't have to worry about the Sharia compliance of it because we've taken care of that for you.
Amazing. So, Muhammad, you've talked a little bit about the Muslim communities. How would you currently characterize the current landscape of Islamic finance in Canada?
Yeah, so I would say that there is still a large opportunity available. It's still a very untapped market. It's still in its early stages. What we've seen in the past 10, 20, 30 years is a lot of auntie and uncle shops that have come around and, have done their best to put their to create, let's call it a Sharia compliant offering. A lot of it is non-AOFI compliant. That's for us, AOFI is the gold standard. And that's kind of what, even when we went into the market with, this term AOFI, the community didn't even know what AOFI meant, right? So that just gave us the signal about like, okay, well, people don't even understand that there is this international standard and framework that Islamic banks can adhere to and adopt in order to create best practices for an industry, especially when there isn't a regulatory framework in place similar to what the UK put into place via the FCA. And so, when you look at today, alhamdulillah, Menzel is the only multi-product platform. We're kind of pioneering on all fronts. Not that we want to, but we just look at it as a have to at this point, just because we have the know-how, we have the expertise, we have the partners that are required to make this happen. And we do have the relationships even at all levels of government that are looking at pursuing this, right? So we're leading the charge on kind of multiple fronts here. And there have been a lot of people that have looked at this market. A lot of people look at it as very small, right? Too niche, and maybe that deters them. It's a highly regulated environment. So for those that don't know, Canada is the second hardest jurisdiction in the world after China to set up anything financial services. We don't have a digital banking license. We don't have open banking here. These are all things that are being discussed at various levels of parliament. And it's been years, right? And nothing has been done about it. And so this has become a real barrier to entry for those that are pursuing this market. And so, they set their sights on a US or another jurisdiction with lower barriers to entry, right? Alhamdulillah, Allah has given us the strength and the resources to overcome that. It's obviously allowed us to be a strong player in the marketplace, but it does cost a lot of money, right? Just to be here. We are held in the same regard and standard as a large bank, right? And that doesn't work well for us, especially if, the regulator wants to knock on our door and ask us questions, right? Because that costs money. You have to hire the best of the best, counsel in order to intervene and to protect your interests. So, of course, this only happens with the support of the community. And I think that the community is slowly starting to turn around and come around to say, well, this is our avenue to really push for, at some point in time, an Islamic bank, right? And we have to support our own to get us there.
Do any of the incumbent banks in Canada, like your RTs or your TDs, offer any kind of like Sharia compliant products of financing products?
They offer absolutely nothing. And in fact, we've been in the same room as those executives. There is absolute no interest in pursuing this market from the perspective of like building out their own products. They still don't understand the opportunity. They don't understand the return on investment. They don't want the reputational risk if they were to do it wrong. There's also marketing risk involved. So they'd rather partner, right? And that's part of the discussions, that are ongoing between us and them. But we've been told, like, a program like this would cost upwards of $100 million, and we don't know, when the payback would be. And they say, well, we don't even know how many Muslims we have even as our clients, right? Nobody's really done the research or the appropriate study to better understand their clientele's religious views and whether, there are products that can be accommodated to assist that. There's also this mentality of, well, they're already our clients. Why would we create something to move them from the left side of the pocket to the right side of the pocket, right? What's the value in that? So, again, Canadian banking professionals, very conservative. They're still holding on to the fact that we had the best, and most stable banking post 2008 financial crisis. This is almost 16 years ago, right? Like, we need to move forward. They look at innovation as bad. They look at competition as bad. They're really, really focused on consumer protection, especially the regulators, and they're comfortable. They're resting on their laurels, and they're happy to clip the amount of money that they're making, and their shareholders get a very, very strong dividend, and there's no need to innovate, right? So that's kind of the mentality that we're running up against, and it's actually bad for the Muslim community, right? Because there's so much demand out there that we can't fulfill at the current time. And there's nothing, there's nothing stopping, anything stopping anyone of introducing new products and capturing some of that market in the time being. And I always felt that the Canadian market can handle multiple players, right? It's not just our brand or our company. We're not going to be able to saturate 100%. It's never going to be the case. But there does need to be this political will and this industry will to say, well, hey, this is an untapped demographic. How do we go after it? And how do we fulfill, right? Whether it's a DEI or an ESG mandate, whatever you want to call it. But, this is an underbanked or an unbanked market currently.
Yeah, just leading on from that. So, what would you say are the biggest areas that need to be served or filled for Muslim or people who are looking for Sharia compliance options?
Definitely, if I look at the lowest hanging fruit is deposit accounts, right? So checkings and savings, or as some of the UK banks call it, like a PLS, profit and loss sharing account. That's like very rudimentary, basic, foundational. Not everyone has the means to own a home in Canada, right? Like the average home price is $1 million. You require a 20% down payment. That becomes quite prohibitive. But it is a big need, right? Like if you look at the demand that we currently have, 20,000 families out of, let's say, 600,000 families, but 20,000 families requires a $10 billion, capital injection in order to fulfill. And that grows by $100 million a month. And that's with zero marketing costs and zero active marketing strategy. And so how do you create a system that enables that, right? Because Muslim Canadians have 50% less home ownership than the typical Canadian. And that's not because of their balance sheets, Hassan. They have very strong balance sheets, but they are in this mentality of, I'm going to save so that I can buy it fully in cash. Mm-hmm. And the rates of the housing market, like the increase in the housing market, your savings rates can't keep up, right? Like if the housing market's increasing by 5 or 10% at values of $1 million, which means, okay, well, every year this property grows by 50 to 100,000. the typical Canadian and Muslim Canadian doesn't have $100,000 in savings on an annual basis to keep up. So there's always going to be a financing gap that needs to be fulfilled. We don't even have a securitization market, right? Or an RMBS market, which would need to be created so that we could issue potentially a sukuk, that's backed by this residential real estate. So there's a whole system that needs to be created in order for this industry to thrive and for every Muslim Canadian to have access to these services on a daily basis.
What do you think of this argument that Islamic finance in its current form, and I've asked people this in the UK and Australia and other countries, that Islamic finance or Islamic banking rather is banking. It's the same as conventional banking, but just with a few Arabic names, and maybe the legal processes are different, but the economic outcome is still the same. But Muhammad, when you studying academia and working with people like Walid Hijazi and all these guys, if you talk to them and talk to the pioneers, Islamic finance is supposed to be a completely different economic model, but in the real world, it doesn't really work like that. For someone who's creating or created a fintech, which is offering Islamic finance products, how difficult is that balance?
I would say it's very difficult because there are multiple opportunities that have been made to us where we could have said, you know what, this can enable our business, this can enable the growth of the industry, but it's not going to be in a Sharia compliant way. And so, we've had to straddle between, let's call it right and wrong, or, ethics and morals. And alhamdulillah, like we've been steadfast and we've said, you know what, even though that money is available to us in a haram way, and we could have justified in saying, well, we'll take the haram and, at least the contract between us and the client is halal. We still didn't want to introduce that into our business model. And we wanted to maintain the sanctity and the purity of that. What we have seen though, Hassan, is, partnerships with these financial institutions. We've created precedent with respect to the contractual engagement, right, between us and them. Whereby, again, because you have an asset that you have recourse against, it's an easier sell, right, to say, hey, you're going to participate on an investment basis and not on a debt basis, right, within these underlying assets. There's full security, there's recourse on these assets, and we're going to model this business to de-risk it as much as possible. Of course, there's still elements of risk, but you can de-risk based on your underwriting criteria. You can de-risk based on the types of properties that you want to invest in. You can de-risk based on, the pricing and the tenure. There's so many elements here, right? And so, alhamdulillah, we've been able to achieve kind of this precedent within these contracts and relationships within these financial institutions and institutional investors that we now can carry that amongst across other potential partners that want to participate in a program like this. So yes, it's been a harder path, a longer path. We've had to, stand our ground and be steadfast. Our Sharia board has been super supportive. Alhamdulillah, they all understand common law jurisdiction. They have very, very good experience within, the UK market and understanding how to structure these agreements. They've seen this stuff before. And, there is a willingness, right, even within the legal community to be like, hey, yeah, you know what? This still doesn't add any additional risk to us as a bank, even though we're participating in this manner, right? And so that's really what you want at the end of the day, is this open-mindedness between industry, between government, between all parties involved to say, hey, this is new, but it's an unlock, right? We're unlocking an untapped opportunity, and let's set our sights on the bigger picture here. And we always find a way through, alhamdulillah.
Do you think like a lot of people really understand the difference between, say, an Islamic economic model, which is more, in my view, like a more venture capital, private equity, risk sharing, profit and loss sharing, risk sharing? Because like if you look at it, for example, Muhammad, I remember about 5 or 6 years ago, I went to a sukuk structuring workshop or an Islamic bank. And the instructor, he was talking about how difficult it is to make a real mudaraba in a deposit account. So if you're telling the Rabb al-Mal, the provider of the capital, that he could lose principal and then some, with people's savings? Is that like a feasible thing to try and educate people on?
So we've done it, I would say, with respect to the Menzel Mortgage Fund, right? Like when you think about that strategy, we look at it as a mudaraba style agreement in the sense that the Rabbul Mal is investing into, right, these musharaka mortgages, which is the underlying assets. There is the risk, right, that they could, lose a portion of their capital, but that risk is very low because when you think about how the model's been structured, well, first of all of this money is pooled, right? So you've already diversified that risk, number one. And if somebody decides to default, well, that actually just means that your profit payment is going to be less next month, right? Versus, the month, today. Now, where the capital becomes at risk is, well, are there a number of actual underwater properties, like from a value? And if you're averaging a 55% finance to value ratio, there's a lot of room, right, before, you actually put yourself in that position. And so I think when you explain that to clients and you give them that awareness and that education and that it has to be done this way in order to maintain the Sharia compliance, they start to say, okay, yeah, you know what? This is a very low risk asset. It's not guaranteed. Of course, the profit payments aren't guaranteed. The principal is not guaranteed, but this is a very low risk. And as we're now 5 years track record and 5 years history. That goes a long way, right? You can show the growth, you can show the stability, you can show that you have very strong underwriting requirements and due diligence when you're assessing these properties. And of course, the clients who are taking these mortgages and that becomes the true value. I think it's if it was just theory, it's very hard to have people overcome that. Even banks, right? Like a lot of banks, they come to us and say, "Well, yeah, we can't share that risk," and then they don't really understand what the shared risk means, and they don't take into context, the asset and the recourse because they're in this mentality of, well, unsecured debt or unsecured lending, fractional banking, all of it, like it's just all leverage, right? Um, and when you look at Islamic finance or the Islamic financial economy in its purest form, it's a much more stable, right, system that they don't really understand, and that education and that awareness needs to be brought forth so that they get on the same page as you, because we're looking at it in one way and they're looking at it in a different way, and you have to kind of bring the meeting of the minds there together.
Another criticism that people have, Muhammad, particularly here in the UK, is that Islamic finance uh, is very expensive compared to the conventional counterparts, and
Yeah.
also there's a trust element there. I'm sure you being in the UK, visiting the UK, and studying the UK's Islamic finance industry, it's had a mixed history, I would say, over the past, say, 30 or 40 years. How are you going to improve? Well, number one, how are you going to be price competitive with your conventional competitors? And then number two, how are you going to ensure trust and reduce skepticism?
Yeah. So I think there's an education piece. A lot of clients don't understand the cost of capital, and how we access capital versus how banks access capital, right? And the analogy is very simple. If you're a licensed bank in Canada, you're a deposit taking institution, you can access capital as low as 0%, especially if it's checkings accounts, savings accounts, like, even the return they give you is, I don't know, 0.5%, maybe 1%. And so if your cost of capital is so low and you lend at 2% or 3% or 4%, that's all margin, that's all profit, right? Of course, there are operational expenses, but like, that's literally revenue that's coming. Now, our program is different. We're not a deposit taking institution. We have to attract capital from investors. And investors come to us and say, well, I can secure my money in this 5 year term deposit at 5%. And that's guaranteed capital and guaranteed return. And you're promising me 5%, but you're a startup and it's not guaranteed return and it's not guaranteed capital. That doesn't make sense to me. So we have to provide some sort of premium. Maybe that number is 5.5%, maybe that number is 6%. So automatically we've increased the cost of capital by at least 1%. And then of course we have to put a little bit of margin on our end to keep the lights running. Over time, right, what we're finding, and we're actually going through this today, we're seeing our cost of capital go down. Why? Because of the history, because of our balance sheet strength, because of the relationships that we've created with these investors, whether they're retail or institutional, and they say, yeah, you know what, this is a solid program. Default rates are zero. We can give them better pricing. And so it's no different than, if we were to create a parallel with the halal food industry. Like 40 years ago, my dad and I would drive out to the only butcher shop out in Mississauga, 40 kilometers away, and a demand exceeded supply. And so what happens? Pricing is up because there's limited availability. And we paid gas to go there and we paid for time. Today, it's alongside in any supermarket at the same price. Why? Because economies of scale have been introduced. So long term, the way I look at least our approach is we do want to be competitively priced, and there is a path to get there. But the path can only get there or be accelerated with the support of the community. Because the more the community trusts us, right? And we'll talk about, trust and skepticism and credibility next. But the faster the community trusts us, that we can, the faster we can get there, right? And so, bridging that gap between trust and credibility is very, very, like it's a sensitive issue, right? Like Canada, the Canadian Islamic finance in Canada doesn't have a clean history. There have been players that have tarnished its reputation, and it's still the elephant in the room in multiple conversations that I have with government and bank executives. And this is why there needs to be, as much as this industry is growing, there still needs to be some sort of regulatory framework and consumer protectionism to be put in place so that we don't encounter halal washing, right? Not everyone should be able to put up their hand and say, well, we're halal too. Well, by what means and by what standards, right? There needs to be an AOFI style framework put into place, at least from a governance perspective, to say, well, if you are going to, not only do you have to do this, within the Canadian space, like in terms of rules and regulations and licensing and compliance, but you also need to adopt, this sort of governance framework, for your Sharia compliance. And so time heals, right? As much as it hasn't, but we look at ourselves as cleaning up the past and showing a professional way forward. And I think that that mentality, especially not just from me, but even within my team, the professionalism, making sure that customer service and customer support is there, making the digital experience really, really good, having these relationships with government, showing the community that, what, even the government supports us on this mandate, that goes a long way, right? And of course, it's not like all 2 million Muslims know about Menzel, right? Every time I enter a new city and a masjid, invites me to speak, there are 90% of the people there have never heard of us, right? And so, you want to get in front of the community. You want to show them and share with them your knowledge, the education, create that awareness, and let them know that these options are now available. We can talk till the cows come home when it comes to the questions that you may have, the skepticism that you may have. But alhamdulillah, thousands and thousands of Muslims are already supporting us from that perspective. And that's really the leverage that we bring to the table today.
Fantastic. Muhammad, as we bring the podcast to a close shortly, there was one thing that just came to my mind when you were talking about the government. How can Islamic finance help fund some of like Canada's infrastructure, or can it help like Canada's economic and financial development?
It certainly can. Again, I think this was one of the reasons, and why the UK introduced some sort of framework, because there's so much money coming in from the GCC, especially into central London commercial and residential real estate. And I don't know whether or not some of that money was used towards infrastructure projects, but there's lots of examples around the world, whether it be in Turkey or in Malaysia, where FDI was brought in to fund, oil projects, highways, and sovereign sukuks were then established as a result of it, right? Like these are things that the government of Canada should be looking at to really solidify itself as a global player within the Islamic finance space. And I truly believe that Toronto, not New York City, Toronto can actually be the epicenter of Islamic banking and finance in North America. The population is there, the knowledge base is there. We are a lot more progressive when it comes to DEI, right? Diversity, equity, and inclusion. We are more progressive when it comes to financial inclusion and all of these terms that are shared these days. And so I think that there is a way, PPP, right? Public-private partnerships. There's a space within the public-private partnership realm that could see industry and government working together to attract, right, private global partners to large projects. Like we have the second largest untapped natural resource globally, right, in terms of oil reserves. And yes, we have this push on climate initiatives, the Kyoto Accords, the Paris Accords, and we're trying to focus on that. But there's a lot of stuff that needs to be rebuilt in Canada. There's been almost 40 years of stagnation. And then when you look at the OECD's latest report, it actually put Canada's GDP and economic growth will stagnate until 2060. Like that's a full generation, right? Like my kids are not going to benefit from anything that was built by us. And so if we really need to focus on what needs to happen in terms of growth, well, having global partnerships, at this scale can certainly help. Like, I don't know if you know, but the Emir of Qatar had visited Canada for the very first time last week. And him and our Prime Minister Justin Trudeau had a very fruitful meeting, and a lot was discussed. Whether it would have been diplomacy efforts or political efforts, but also investment opportunities. And I really hope that more and more of those types of discussions happen, especially within the Middle East and North Africa, because we've been to those regions. We understand the opportunity. We understand the amount of capital that's flowing into those countries, and I think that those countries can certainly help. A G7 country like Canada to really propel itself into the next century, and of course support the next generation.
And we should all say this, that Islamic finance is not mutually exclusive for Muslims, right? It's for everybody.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I always say it's designed for Muslims, but by default for everyone else.
Yeah. Mohammed, the other question I wanted to ask you was about Manzil. I think you said you set this up in 2017, and obviously you've been through like the pandemic years, or you were.
Yes.
How was that running a company or setting up a fintech during the pandemic?
It wasn't fun. There was a lot of adjustments. We had to be super agile, and we, really needed to focus on what moved the needle. We had some great advisors, some great mentors. The team, of course, itself, just going through that. I can't thank them enough, right, for putting up with me and putting up with everything that we had to kind of do to survive, right? Like it was literally survival mode. And alhamdulillah, with our strength and our religion, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, of course supported us along that journey. I feel like we still haven't come out of it, right? Like, because after COVID, we kind of went into a recession, high interest rates, inflation. So I'm saying to myself, I'm like, okay, if we can survive these bad times, like I wonder what it looks like during good times. And inshallah, those good times are coming soon. But for us, it's really, that environment really helped us align kind of our foundation when it comes to risk and how we approach certain situations, how we approach partnerships, or how we approach even just dealing with the community, right? Like it's not just us going through this, everybody's going through it, right? So maintaining that agility, maintaining that adaptability with kind of this mindset of survival of the fittest, I think really plays a role. And we constantly have to remind ourselves that we're not immune to anything, right? And just as quick as it has been given to us, it can be taken away from us. And we want to be cognizant of that at all times, inshallah.
Inshallah. Muhammad, tell us any current projects or upcoming projects you're working on.
Yeah, okay. So Alhamdulillah, I think the timing of this podcast has been certainly fortuitous. We recently acquired a couple of companies, one in Canada, which just strengthens and enhances kind of the Menzel Invest platform. And by company, I mean like we've acquired an individual Muslim advisor's book of business, and he's now leading kind of the Menzel wealth strategy. The Menzel robo advisory product, it only fulfills a certain part of the demographic, right? Usually the lower level accounts, like 100,000 or less, people that don't really need financial planning advice, or need any sort of hand holding across the finish line. Once your assets are at a certain level, you do want that advice. You want that personal relationship. And so, Menzel Invest and Menzel Wealth go hand in hand with that. And so that was the reason why we acquired this individual's book of business. We obviously, he's coming on to lead the Menzel Wealth strategy, and inshallah, build out a team and go countrywide with that. So that was, I look at that as an enhancement to the business. And inshallah, once it becomes public, there'll be a press release. So, for those listening to this, follow us on LinkedIn or follow me on LinkedIn, and inshallah, you'll be the first to know once these acquisitions go public. The second one actually is an expansion opportunity. So we acquired a halal robo investment advisory firm out of the US. And so this will be our foray into the US market with the Menzel Invest product once it's fully rebranded. And it's fully licensed in 49 of the 50 states. So we're very excited about, not only the licensing piece, the ability to expand the product shelf via that license out of the US. And it allows us the opportunity to now set up, the foundational elements for a fully Sharia-compliant mortgage program, right? Similar to how we did that in Canada. So we're super, super excited about that. And inshallah, Menzel Invest US, once public, it'll launch, look out for that. We're planning on that launch before the end of the year. And so this will allow us a North American footprint and of course, start to pick up the low-hanging fruit and the demand that's been pent up within the US Muslim consumer base there. And then finally, I would say that, we are exploring and in advanced talks with respect to deposit style products. As I mentioned, this is, I think, absolutely foundational for a Muslim consumer. And inshallah, we're hoping that if everything goes well, that this is a product that we'd be able to launch sometime in 2025, and that would include a checkings account with a debit Visa card and a savings account that would act like a PLS or a profit and loss sharing account with underlying assets of our halal mortgage program or any other type of financing program that would produce kind of the variable profits to our consumers. So inshallah, and that would be both US and Canada, right? There's an opportunity to do both at once, cross-border, as we like to call it. So hopefully that gives some excitement and to our listeners here, and inshallah they can follow us for more as these developments continue.
Fantastic. And Mohammed, what's the best way to reach you? I think you've said you're on social media, but what's the best way to reach you?
Yeah, so Instagram at GetMenzel, Twitter at GetMenzel. We're also on LinkedIn. I'm also on LinkedIn. I post a lot of my stuff through LinkedIn, like just the professional community. But Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, as well as Twitter, you can find us at GetMenzel or Menzel Inc. So that's the best way to reach us. And then, of course, the starting point for anybody that wants access to our products, especially if you're Canadian, is menzel.ca.
Great. I'll link it in the show notes after our conversation. But Mohammed Sawaf, I wish you all the best in all your new products and going into 25.
Jazakallah khairan, Hassan. Really appreciate this.
Yeah, Mohammed, take care.
You too. Assalamu alaikum.
So.